All right, so this is the fourth session in the series, and we're going to we're not going to finish everything that I had planned, although Gloria has kindly offered me to hold another session next Tuesday, but we'll see how far we get tonight, where we end up, and see if that's satisfactory. So, um, I want to start just by reminding us what we're doing in this course. We really do have to be mindful of trying to keep in our thoughts as you're listening to these conceptual and analytical thoughts about how to do these kinds of emptiness meditations, that they're all about the Four Noble Truths and understanding them and holding that in one's mind. See that the Four Noble Truths clearly point towards a way forward when we get to the fourth Noble Truth, that suffering is something that can be worked with in a positive way. So then here, and the way I want us to think about this, think of it, suffering as a disease. It's not the way things really exist in terms of what we experience, and that's what causes suffering, and that there is a treatment for it, if you will, a medicine, the last bullet point that's there. And one of those medicines, there's many in the Buddhist playbook or toolbox of practices, but here we're focused on specific analytical reasoning meditations on emptiness. So just keep that in mind. And that specifically, we're talking about, there are a number of these kinds of meditations, but specifically, my focus and goal was to bring us to being able to at least start to investigate these three types of reasonings. Tonight, we'll probably only get into the sevenfold reasoning. And if I have time at the end, I'll do a quick overview of diamond slivers and dependent arising. And those might be the what could be the content of a fifth Tuesday evening next Tuesday if we choose to do that. So the first thing that I'd like to talk about a little bit more, and it's all based on feedback I receive, both in the questions we had during last week's session, and then also further dialogue I've had with people during the week. So I'm going to bring us first, before we get into what you see on the screen, um, two questions that we had from the last session. And the first one had to do with one of the participants saying that they didn't understand how everything can be dependently arising as mere nominal name and concept. And it's really, really super, super important that we understand that. So when we go back to the traditional wheel of life diagram, and we remember the 12 links of dependent origination that are in the outer rim of this, they contain the 12 links of what we call dependent arising or dependent origination. Those links are represented here with, they're numbered so we can see them. But I've already talked in detail about the first four because that's at the heart. Understanding those first four are at the heart of understanding the answer to that question. And so here we have to recall that the first link, which is represented by a blind person in the upper left-hand corner there, is represents ignorance. And that ignorance specifically is grasping onto everything that dependently arises moment by moment in our consciousness as having inherent existence. We call it self-grasping. Self because it's this mistaken identity of ourself having inherent existence and the object we're engaging with having such. That creates the energy. Think of it as energy, something that is very subtle, powerful, that then moves us energetically into the second link, which is a potter who is making, in the process of making um, vases or pots. They look like vases. And that's important because it's the energy of that ignorance that was created in the first link that then leads to us forming in our mind stream karmic imprints. And then once they're fully formed, that's the second link. Once they're fully formed, that becomes the first half of the third link. The first half being causal um, consciousness. So those karmic seeds, once they're fully formed, the potter's finished his work and you have a pot or a vase. That is a karmic seed. It's completed. It then has the full potential to definitely, according to the laws of karma, ripen into a resultant effect. And so when we talk about the first half of the third link, that is the causal consciousness fully taking form, still very subtle. This is not like some sort of object out here. This is in our mind stream. And then as that imprint um, that is fully formed, that karmic seed, actually manifest. And here we're talking about in the form of a new life. Remember, we are looking at the links as they create the ongoing cycle of rebirth and samsara. So here that energy manifests. We call that projecting karma, and it specifically takes us to a that energy takes us, manifests, and takes us to that energy, meaning the causal consciousness that has now moved into the second half of the third link, which is the resultant consciousness. It moves us into an actual new life in one of the realms. So if it's a human realm, that's the point of conception that occurs. And at that point, that energy, that result, we think of this as subtle energy in one's subtle consciousness, then that energy is what takes full initial form as it's then reaches the point of actually being a full rebirth, meaning you're born, actually born. Then every single moment that you're experiencing is a rapid fire experience of karmic ripenings that all go back to the first link. They're all imbued with that mistaken experience of seeing things as yourself and things as inherently existent. And they all take the form of consciousness, the consciousnesses, the mental consciousness and the the five sense consciousnesses that dependently arise every single moment based on those karmic ripenings. And that's what we call name. It's that name that is that ripening karma that takes rebirth and then has that torrent flow of experience, mistaken experience. And so when we say that things exist nominally by mere name and concept, then this is like what we're talking about. So that results in the fourth link. And so it's important to know that this goes on constantly. It's not just an event that happens at conception and an actual birth, but this is what is going on in the flow of our mind. And when we get into doing these kind of practices that we're discussing in this course, one starts to be able to see them very clearly occurring. So this is something to keep in mind. So, for example, when I say dependent arising of the mind consciousness um, working constantly with the sense consciousnesses, then we could take the example of like the visual eye consciousness and how it arises in concert with the mind consciousness of those objects that it experiences dependently. And it's like a series of rapid film stills put together and it moves, visually moves, and you experience things in the form of images visually. So that happens with all five of the senses. And so it's a real torrent of karmic ripenings that are occurring. That's why it takes so much effort through doing analytical meditations like this and other practices to identify it, take the time to identify it, see what it is, and go, ah, and then be able to work with it. All these meditations start by first being able to identify um, what would be an inherent existent object, including yourself, if one were to exist. And we'll get into that tonight. So this labeling with name and concept is something that we partake in every single moment with our body, speech, and mind. It's present every single moment. Um, and so it's our mixing up, misidentifying all these arisings as being inherently existing, meaning more than just mere name, dependently arising moment by moment. That's where we get into trouble. So the antidote is really moving our mind out of that cycle of ignorance that starts with the first link. And it continues all the way through all 12 links. We don't have time to talk about all 12 links tonight. And this is how one actually is able to, when we do the kind of meditations where we're able to identify the lack of inherent existence and that things ultimately, and that things conventionally have just a mere nominal existence, that we can cut off at the root the ignorance that creates that initially, and therefore cut off the karmic formations that result from that energy that is occurring all the time out of ignorance. That's why they say it's so important to cut off self-grasping through ignorance, which is the first link in the in this in this process that we're talking about. So I wanted to just really emphasize that because it's just so important to get that. And if we don't get that, it's kind of hard to understand like what we're dealing with, and the need to, why is it important to understand conventional reality and ultimate reality? Because one's mistaken in terms of how we experience it, not that it doesn't exist, but the way we misidentify it. And clearing that up allows us to discover both the truth of conventional um, dependent arising and then the truth of ultimate reality, which is emptiness. So that's why it's so important to understand the karma. That's why this course is called Karma and Emptiness. Simple, but it's important. Mm. So there's a lot more I can say about that, but I'll leave it alone. I want to go to the other question, though, before we continue, that we had last session as well, which was a very direct question, a very asking for a very tangible kind of um, result from if we do emptiness meditations. First, if we study emptiness and we understand it, and then we understand the emptiness meditations and we do them, and we start to have some sort of result, the question was like, well, what actually really changes, like in terms of your experience? Um, so this is something that I wanted to just spend a little bit. I answered the question, but I want to spend a little bit more time on because hopefully it's a little bit of inspiration for like why we would even attempt to do these kinds of meditations, which can be very challenging. Um, but once we start doing them, you'll see that the results, but also that it's a lot of hard work too. You can't just do it once and go, ah, I get it. So I start answer by readdressing that question. First, by saying, giving some advice that His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, gives, which is a person who studies emptiness may assert phenomena lack true existence, but their mind still grasps, just like the first link there, true existence. So knowing the words of the teaching, meaning conceptually and intellectually, isn't enough. We must seek experiential realizations, end quote. So get this clear. If you only study emptiness but don't take it further into reflection and meditation, you will not experience too much change, answering that question from last week, in how you experience everything. Karmic ripenings caused by ignorant self-grasping, leading to karmic seeds, will still be what is taking place in your mind, because they always are, moment by moment. And unless one engages beyond the intellectual understanding of emptiness and get into meditation practices like the reason analysis of the ultimate, then that torrent flow of karmic ripenings that are mistakenly informed will just continue. There's no way you're going to see change. There's no way. It's just not going to happen. So further, His Holiness says that about taking one's understanding of emptiness into meditation. At first, this understanding's conceptual, but when it's combined with firm concentration, single point concentration, or as Lama Tsongkhapa says, serenity, it can penetrate reality to the core, where you can then directly perceive emptiness without reliance on words and concepts. It's experiential. Then further, he says, as the mind becomes more and more accustomed to the emptiness of inherent existence by continuous, and then he says, intense meditation. This is like more answering the question from last week now. The conceptual appearance of the inferential realization of emptiness, meaning the one that you intellectually learned and the one that you started to chip away at in meditation, that starts to fade. And a direct non-conceptual realization of a yogic, direct perceiver that cognizes emptiness now emerges as inherent existence, which is the object of self-grasping in these meditations, is disproved by this kind of analytical reasoning analysis. Repeatedly, 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 the self-grasping mind is naturally damaged until it finally ceases. End quote. So His Holiness says that this is what occurs. But one can't just go to a class, read books, study. One has to go further into the actual meditation practices, even if you understand them intellectually very well. So in the process, in this progress of the progression of damaging the self-grasping mind, further answering the question from last week, one starts to naturally let go of it. What? The self-grasping mind, meaning the one that occurs in the first link of dependent origination. The self-grasping, it's a visceral feeling. The self-grasping loosens and loosens and loosens. And so on. It continues until it is actually completely extinguished. So I'm saying that in my own words, similar to what His Holiness just said. So, what does this look like on a day-to-day reality? Which I think is what the question was really getting at, asked last week. Meaning when one isn't in meditative equipoise. So, on emptiness, especially. So, I can share with you that from various texts and also experience and from fellow practitioners and from teachers, we can say some of the following. All appearances of mind, speech, and body very gradually start to literally lack this quality of self-grasping. When the Lama says conventional reality is like an illusion, they don't mean that things are unreal or don't exist. Rather, we clearly start to experience them through these meditation practices as lacking any inherent self-existence and that they're simply dependent arising. It's almost like, duh, everything is dependent arising. Nothing is even possible to be anything but that. So that whole self-grasping to inherently existing self and phenomena, that's that process of it sort of fading that His Holiness talks about. And it's visceral. You can feel it in your moment by moment experience, those karmic ripenings that you experience based on how I was answering the first question and why it's so important to understand how karma takes place. You're starting to chip away at cutting it off at the root. And it happens gradually and it's powerful and it's a very pleasant experience, if you will. So it starts gradually and sporadically, meaning it doesn't happen all at once. This loosening starts to happen in changes in the way you react to things, especially emotionally. So I'll give you one example. So, for example, when this is a really extreme example, but this is how you identify what self-grasping is. You have to try to look at your own moment by moment experiences and see how you're doing it every single moment. But we're not used to analyzing our moment by moment reality. So we don't, we're like, what is it? What what is it? And remember, in Buddhist cosmology, you've been experiencing things in this mistaken way since beginningless time. So it's a pretty deep habit and seems normal. Suffering existence seems normal. So, an example, when getting the news that you have a serious illness, you normally might say, "What? I have cancer?" in a way that is really tinged with a deep feeling that you're losing something that inherently exists. That's a deep sense of I, and that your body is mine, and that you are losing something that you own, yourself. That is a very powerful case of being able to look at like how this is operating in your moment by moment experience, meaning identifying everything as inherently self-existing. But when you have a clear understanding and even maybe an experiential sense of the lack of inherent existence, you experience that kind of news like an illusion. Again, not that it doesn't exist or isn't happening, but you're not grasping onto it with a self that isn't real, that isn't inherently existing. That's the meaning of like an illusion. And this opens up space in your mind stream to see clearly that the way things simply dependently arise karmically, they arise in this mistaken way that I've been just talking about. The first and second links operating and the rest that follows, all the way through to 12, which is death and dying and death. So here, in the you staying with this example, the cancer and you or the I have arisen out of that, but it doesn't exist the way you previously thought. And that space in your mind stream that you would normally, just rapidly flowing through your mind stream, grasp with some sense of real loss, real meaning inherent and existent loss, creating anger, creating anxiety, frustration, fear, worry, and maybe more, is the real killer, not the cancer. Those are the mental afflictions. That's where real suffering occurs. And when you're in that mode of having an understanding of emptiness and actually at least some inferential experience of it, those emotions simply are no longer there. And that's the answer to the question that was presented to me at the end of last week. This is what starts to end suffering, even in our ordinary lives. Doesn't end cancer for that person, that example, but what it is, what's the real culprit behind it, that can be seen clearly through these kinds of understandings of emptiness and doing these kinds of meditations. So it doesn't just go for big events like that. And you start doing these kind of meditations, you start to identify these actual self-existent, inherent self-existent graspings that you're doing every single moment in your own mind stream. You're able to see them, and it's quite powerful because you're looking for them now. So it's quite interesting. Um, so, it could be another example, which is a little bit more mundane and not as dramatic, would be like someone accusing you of maybe not paying attention to them when they're speaking to you because you're involved in doing something else. This happens to all of us, I'm sure. um, your reaction might be one of anger, like, what? I was paying attention. I heard you. Don't accuse me of not listening. And then the more you understand and experience emptiness of self and phenomena, you gain clarity of seeing that this kind of self-grasping, you can see it, you can catch yourself and identify it. And that can become an object for you in your meditations on emptiness, where you analyze that. And then that's more powerful too, where you then see that it lacks inherent self-existence. Your anger, let's say, because it's going on every single moment. It's always present. I've already said that. So then this is important to sort of get a good handle on understanding what happens. And the more and more you do this, you're putting in your mind stream um, the by by removing the mistaken arisings of seeing and experiencing everything as inherently self-existence with your consciousness and your sense consciousnesses, then that's the change. The less that's in your mind stream, meaning every single moment, over time, gradually, it can disappear, change, and then disappear eventually, where you no longer react in any way, shape, or form with anything other than like virtuous arisings in your mind. Gentle, caring, loving, kind, heightened sense of beauty, wonder, awe, joy, and even bliss. Eventually, this fully permeates all of what occurs in your mind, in your speech, and your actions. This is what can be the result of the practices. Um, and most important, from a Buddhist practitioner point of view, um, you start to see yourself with a more realistic view, a more honest view. Your enthusiasm to create virtuous causes, because you understand both karma and emptiness, increases. And you want to get at it now In addition, the quality of your virtue will become more refined and purer. So now you get a sense of how you could get closer to actual liberation. Again, from remembering the four noble truths, and the fourth one being that there is a path to end suffering. You can get a sense that you can become closer to liberation and ending that suffering. So this should inspire you to um, move you to have real motivation to engage further and deeper into these kinds of practices that actually, never mind, like beat cancer, they'll end suffering, hearkening back to my earlier example. So then there's nothing more important. And once you see that through doing these meditations, it's very profound. Um, and you could start to see how karma could actually be cut off at the root. And of course, when you conjoin these with practices in the Buddhist tradition of renunciation and bodhicitta, having a full understanding of the four noble truths, then this is even more powerful. And we can understand finally what the lamas mean when they say like an illusion. So, with all that said, I answered those two questions a little more fully, and also some inquiries that we had mm, along the way during this past week. So I'm going to go back to where we left off now last week, where we'll start to explore the sevenfold reasoning of Chandrakirti. Um, we have to first, though, understand clearly Nagarjuna's two objects of negation. We've all know, if you've attended the last three classes, I've pounded into your head. What's the object of negation? Inherent existence. Okay, but Nagarjuna identifies two objects of negation. The first one is actually ignorance. And here, how's ignorance different than inherent existence? Ignorance exists. What does that mean? It means that we have a mind that grasps at inherent or true existence. That is, according to Nagarjuna, the root of samsara, suffering existence. And it cannot be refuted, but it can be counteracted and eliminated. Not the mind, and I should say, but the mind's grasping. It can't be counteracted, but it can be eliminated. The reason it can be eliminated is because it exists. This is what we're transforming, if you will, eliminating. So hopefully you understand that. And then juxtapose that with Nagarjuna's other object of negation, which is inherent existence. That doesn't exist. So it's not that that's what's being eliminated. That's the object apprehended by that grasping mind, but it doesn't exist at all. And this technique of the refutation that we use in reasoned analysis that we're about to, explore a little bit tonight is what we call probing awareness. It's done where we keep this in mind. We're eliminating grasping. We do that through eliminating thinking that something that exists that doesn't exist, um, uh, it is looked at closely, and then once we negate it, it's just not there. So, but it isn't something that's eliminated in the sense of ignorance. Ignorance is something that exists. So that might sound a little academic or even wonky, or maybe it's clear. That would be good. But try to keep it in mind, and maybe it becomes clearer. So you might remember at the end of last week, we started out with a verse by that comes from the sutras. It's one of the Buddha's students, who was in meditation and was approached by Mara, tempted by Mara, if you will. Mara being the personification of self-grasping. That's something to really keep in mind. And that question and the query that was made to the student by Mara was um, a question about an external creator that isn't everything created that way. And the response of the student to Mara was self is a demonic mind. You have a wrong view. These conditioned aggregates are empty. There is no living being in them. Just as the word car, she used the word chariot, but I substituted car here. Just as the word car is used in dependence on a collection of parts, so when the aggregates exist, there is a conventional, a living being versus no living being in dependence upon the aggregates. So this is a very powerful two sets of verses. There's so much going on here. So here we started our initial exploration that will lead us into our first meditation using um, some of what the sevenfold reasoning has to offer us. So here we first have to understand that a demonic mind only means self-grasping ignorance. That's the root of samsara. We just talked about that a moment ago. That's the great impediment to liberation. And that gives rise to the negative forces. They're called the four maras. And here we also want to take a moment to understand what self means. That's why I have it highlighted. Self means a, a, a mind that experiences everything as inherently existing, especially oneself in relationship to the aggregates. And in that first verse, the student is saying, the disciple of the Buddha is saying, there's no living being there in those conditioned aggregates because they're empty. No living being meaning inherent self existing. And then uses the analogy of a car. But first, we have to understand what those four Mara negative forces are. The mental and physical aggregates under the control of what? Afflictions and karma. We should know a little bit more deeply now what that really means, as we just talked about the 12 links of dependent origination. This relates directly to the second link. And then the afflictions, which are the causes of a person taking these aggregates, that's directly related to the second, the third, and fourth link. And then death under the control of afflictions and karma, then this is related to the 12th link. And really all the links that proceed after the fourth link. And then external hindrances such as Mara that cause difficulties. Then these are sort of, not sort of, these are the accompanying conditions. We talk about causes and conditions, secondary factors that work in concert or conjoined with karma. So we're going to go through this meditation, but first we have to understand some other things about let's go stay on this page for a minute, about the verse. Independence on, you see, I have that highlighted as well, is a key phrase here. So keep that in mind. So we make a few statements that we extrapolate in analysis out of this verse. Car is conventionally designated. We're looking at the second verse now. In dependence on the aggregates. But the car is neither the aggregates or the collection of the aggregates. Here, meaning parts or collection of parts, as you can see in the verse there. Similarly, the self. Now we're applying this to self because you can do that in this analogy. Similarly, the self, person, or I is not the aggregates, nor is it independent of the aggregates. Rather, the I is designated in dependence on the collection of the aggregates. So that kind of brings us to a conclusion, which is what we are supposed to then try to focus on in a meditation. The conclusion is just as a car is not found in its parts and exists by being designated in dependence on the assembly or the collection of the parts, so too is the person a mere convention without any findable essence. Essence here is code for inherent existence, self standing free of dependently arising reality. So that takes us, keeping that in mind, we take that into this analytical, it's a very simple, because this is an introductory um, way to get into the sevenfold reasoning. So the meditation, as you go through the verse and the short explanation that I gave, using the car as the example, your goal here is to examine the relationship between a car and its parts. So it simply has 3 points. First one, is the car the same thing as one of its parts? If it is one part, meaning the car, then there's no need for many parts to be assembled for a car to exist. The second reasoning, is it, meaning the car, exactly identical to the collection of its parts? Since each car part is not a car, a collection of car parts is an assembly of non-cars. That is not a car. And then the third reasoning, is it found apart from its parts? If the car can be found separate from the car parts, you could ride an elephant and call it a car. So these three statements start to bring us into the reason refuting inherent existence according to the sevenfold reasoning. And we'll go a little deeper into that now. So the next thing to say is a person versus a car. So when we do a sevenfold analysis that has a real purpose, we might care a lot about our car, like a lot. Some people really love their cars, but a car is it's not a person. No matter how you might feel your car inherently exists and you feel really strongly about that, um, you have to understand that a car, a person, is everything. It stands at the center of everything in your life. Remember what I was just saying before about moment by moment reality that ripens in your mind, the karmic ripenings that are going on. So it's a lot harder because what was just presented in the form of those questions really just had to do with the first two of the seven reasonings. Either a car and its parts are the same, identical, or number two, a car and its parts are, and we're speaking, when we say identical, we mean inherently. And number two, a car and its parts are completely separate inherently. One can stand without the other. And if you look back at those three questions, you can see that is what is being addressed in those reasonings. But there's seven reasons because it's hard. It's hard to look at the inherent existence of a person versus a car and really break it down over and over and over again through the use of the seven different reasonings versus just two, but really all seven could be folded into those two. Um, because it's hard. It's hard to break that. So it's an exercise, an analytical exercise of reasoning to use variations of the first two, if you will. Um, so um, then we go through, let me just find where I left off here. So then we go to the next point before we dive into the sevenfold reasoning directly. That one was like an introduction to it. So when we use the sevenfold reasoning, the first thing we have to make sure we stay clear on, because it's one of the things we're trying to untangle, is what's called the designated object, which is the car, and the basis of designation, which is the parts of the car or the collection of parts of the car. You have to keep the two separate. Usually they're conflated when people are doing these kind of meditations. So one of the things we do is untangle that with this kind of analysis. Um, so this is important to keep in mind. But first, we need to establish, can a car exist inherently or in one of these seven ways that are listed on the screen? So this is part of meditation on the sevenfold reasoning path. The car is totally separate from its parts. Can it exist that way? That is designated object, the car, and its basis of designation, remember its parts, are unrelated and different. You could answer that yourself. The car is identically one with its parts. The designated object, meaning the car, and its basis of designation, meaning the parts, are inherently the same or identical. The car possesses its parts. The designated object possesses the basis of designation. Again, this designated object is the car, possesses the parts, either as a different entity in the way a person possesses a dog, or as one entity in the way a tree possesses its core. Number four, a car is based on its parts. The designated object is inherently based on the basis of designation. And number five, the car is what its parts are based on. The designated object is what the basis of designation is inherently based on. Key word in all these is inherently. Number six, the car is the collection of its parts. The designated object is the basis of designation. Number seven is the last one. The car is the shape or arrangement of its parts. The designated object is the shape or arrangement of the parts of the basis of designation. So if you think of any of these as I was reading them, and if you were grasping them, and if any of them seem like, yeah, maybe that's the way a car can exist, then you now have your diagnosis, which is you're not seeing how things exist in a clear-eyed fashion. That mistaken way of identifying the car in this case, and therefore all objects, is a real problem for you. So you need to work on it. As Chandrakirti says that a car cannot exist in any of these seven ways. And the meditations do bear that out. So, how does a car exist? We need to think deeply about these points by doing the sevenfold reasoning, analyzing the ultimate. So here are the actual sevenfold reasonings that one undertakes using a car, and it can be applied to anything. We're going to move right from this into applying it to our self and our aggregates. But let's not jump ahead. So here we need to know what the seven reasonings are. The first two are the most important. Is the car inherently different from its parts? Keyword is inherently. Is the car inherently the same as, one with its parts? And then the third one, does the car inherently possess its parts? You start to remember that this is starting to address some of these seven ways that the car cannot exist. Are the parts inherently supported by the car? Is the car inherently supported by its parts? Is the car the collection of its parts? Is the car the shape of arrangement of its parts? So when we look at these, we can take each one and analyze them. And then once we complete that analysis and we come to a conclusion, it's that conclusion that we bring into single pointed concentrated meditation. So we'll just take the first two because of time constraints, because I want to get into the self and the aggregates as they can be applied, taking directly from the sevenfold reasoning and putting it into that context. Because we're a lot more interested in ourselves as we might exist than a car. So, but we'll go through the first two. Let's just think for a moment clearly about the first question. Is the car inherently different from its parts? Remember, inherently. If two things were inherently different, here we're talking about the car and its parts, they would be totally unrelated. Remember, inherently, they stand on their own without depending on anything else. There's two faults that would result if the car and its parts were completely unrelated. One, we would be able to see the car and its parts separately, just as we see a table and a chair separately. The axle, tires, and so forth could exist in one place and the car in another place. However, when we see the car, we also see its parts. And the second fault is that we could not designate car on those parts because there would be no relationship between the car and the hood, the engine, and the rest of it. They would be totally unrelated. The car wouldn't be the designated object, and the parts wouldn't be the basis of designation. Designated object and basis of designation need a dependent relationship. They cannot inherently be different. We should be able to clearly see that that answer to that first question is clear. So then we'll just quickly take the second point. Is the car inherently the same as, meaning one with its parts? If the car were inherently one with its parts, the car and its parts would be exactly the same and inseparable. A quality that applies to one would automatically apply to the other. For example, if the car were green, the color of the car, then the engine should be green. That's one of its parts. And then there's three fallacies that would occur if a car were inherently one with its parts. First one, since there are many parts, there would be many cars. Each part would be a car. The steering wheel would be a car. So would the engine, the axle, the tires, etc. Number two fallacy. Alternatively, since there is one car, there would be only one part. So the third one's a little harder to take in, but try to listen if you're still awake. Agent and object would be one. Normally we say the car is the possessor of the parts. That's the agent. And the parts are what are possessed, the object. we differentiate between the agent, the part possessor, and the object, the parts. The car is one thing, its parts are separate. However, if the part possessor car and its parts were inherently one, they would be exactly the same. And this differentiation could not be made, the one of having an agent and an object. They would have to be one. There's no way around it. So we could not talk about the tire of the car, the tires of the car, because the tires in the car would be identical. We couldn't change the tire because the tire would be the car if they were inherently one and the same. In fact, even using the word car would be unnecessary because we could simply say tire and people would understand car since the two would be inherently the same. So, of course, if we had omit, remember all the chatter over the last 3 weeks that we're only looking at one object of negation in these meditations. It's looking to see that something is inherent, doesn't have an inherent existing quality. So, keeping that in mind, if we remove the word inherently, it's important to then, if we do that, what are we doing? We're speaking not any longer about its ultimate reality, but its conventional reality. Yeah? And then there, we could definitely say at the conventional level that the parts and the car have the same nature, but they are not one with the car. The parts in the car have one nature because they exist at the same time and cannot exist without each other. What is that? That's dependent arising. So, however, they are not one because they aren't the same in every respect. We're speaking conventionally here. The tires are made of rubber, but the car isn't. There's only one part of the car. So conventionally, the parts and the car are different, but they are not different natures. That's what we mean when we say they're not different natures. They're different because the car isn't the parts. They are not different natures because they can't exist without each other. This is so important. So here, as we analyze the ultimate nature, we're only focused on inherent existence. Can we find that in the car? That's the object. And as we come to the conclusion that we can't, we also at the same time, then in reflective analysis afterwards, we can see how does it exist conventionally. This underscores conventional truth of the object. And that's important because we're establishing both. By doing this kind of analysis, we establish clearly what ultimate nature is of the object, but then also its conventional nature. This helps us to avoid the extremes of nihilism and absolutism. This is where we truly then start to experience the middle way. This is what the middle way is. There's a question.
Hi, yeah. Would number six also include the ultimate existence, even though it's lacking the word inherent? Or would that be analyzing it conventionally and recognizing that on a conventional level, it's dependent on its parts, but not on an ultimate?
Yeah.
I don't know if that
So
makes sense.
it does. Yeah. Often in uh, verse, whether it's this kind of analytical listing of reasons or like in verses like we're going to look at in a moment that come from Nagarjuna, then often it doesn't use the word inherent or inherently, but it is. It could say is the car the collection inherently the collection of its parts. when we go, when again, I'm going to skip these analysis for tonight. If I went through them, you would see that it's similar. So, in the same thing with number seven, is the car inherently the shape of arrangements of its parts? So, all seven of these reasonings should, we should understand them to have the word inherently as the first five do. So that's very astute of you to see that those last two didn't have it. Um, but they are reasonings that are only looking for the way things exist here, a car, ultimately, meaning does it have an inherent self-existent quality to it? Okay.
Yeah, that makes sense. So basically, just within translation, sometimes the word inherent won't show up. But if the
Yeah,
heading says something like ultimate and we're doing an emptiness meditation, assume ultimate.
that's right. Especially when we're talking about a meditation practice here that says at the top, analyzing the ultimate. Because as I mentioned in previous classes, that there's only one object of negation when we're doing reasoning, analyzing the ultimate, and that is inherent existence. So whether it's stated or not, this is what you have to keep in mind. And it's the same thing with the verse that we just went through. Not to go back to it, but the one where we were taking baby steps into this more robust version of here when I got to go all the way back here. So here it says, where it says these are conditioned aggregates are empty. And then it says independence on a collection of parts. So when the aggregates exist, it means inherently exists. Okay.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Okay. Actually, that's not right. Let me go back and say that this is not a good example of that. I'll find some other ones though when we get to the next verses. Because here when it says so when the aggregates exist, they mean merely independence, like nominally. So not inherently. So strike that. But still, what I was saying about the way these verses are, these 7 points are listed. I could put the word inherently in here and it probably should, although that's not how they're normally stated. Um, but I answered, I think, clearly what we were trying to say. All right, so let's move on. Time is running. The hourglass is running. So, what is the conclusion of doing the sevenfold reasoning? It's to exhaust all possible ways that a person or phenomena could exist. So here, this is like I'm bringing this up because this is the problem most of us have. So, as you're sitting here tonight, which one are you? Are you an essentialist or a prasangika? You're like, you're like, okay, what the hell is he talking about? So here, let me just frame this for you. Because if you're experienced in these meditations, then you're not caught in this trap, especially if you're having success with them. But if you're not and you're new to them, you could go back and look at those 7 ways something can exist and actually say, I could see that. Then you really need to that you've got that disease that needs the antidote of doing these meditations, if you will. So here we're going to look at ourselves and say, an essentialist, these are those who assert true or inherent existence. They claim that an inherent existence car, this is what we're talking about here, exists. What do they point to as being an inherently existing car? The thing in front of them. It's made of metal and so on and functions to efficiently move people and objects to different places. Um, it is if the car, this is the key, already inherently is there before anyone designated the collection of parts as car. But for the car to come into being, doesn't it necessitate people imagining such a vehicle using words and images, such as a vehicle, and constructing it? doesn't it dependently have to arise? In other words, the car is dependent on us as a society conceiving of that particular collection of miscellaneous things arranged into a very specific manner that then is identified as a car dependently. It's the car doesn't exist inherently. It can only exist dependently. So this is a claim, though, that anybody who's an essentialist would make. They're like, come on, there's the car. It exists. It's like as if it's existed always. Not true. How did it come into existence? How does it continue to be in existence? Designated independence on a collection of parts. That idea has to be connected to that. So Prasangika asserts that everything exists imputedly, in dependence on its basis of designation, the parts in this case. But the designated object, meaning the car, and the basis of designation are not the same. We just went through that in the analysis that we did. So this is something that we could apply not just to a car, but to everything. Everything. And Prasangikas contend that there is not anything in existence that is independently arising because its nature lacks inherent self-existence, its ultimate nature. It conventionally dependently arises, ourself included, the Buddha included. There's, everything is lacks inherent self-existence. So this is something that you decide which one you are. That's why I put that on there. And then we talk about what are the benefits of contemplating and meditating the 7 points. I already mentioned this first. All 7 points can be subsumed into the first two. Again, we didn't have time to do the third through the seventh analysis, but the two, meaning the car is not inherently one with or inherently separate from its parts. And then the benefit is that this counteracts the extreme of absolutism and counteracts the extreme of nihilism, which I just mentioned. And it frees us um, frees us from these two extremes. And in the process, we can truly see and experience the middle way, which I just finished talking about. So one other thing here, though, to mention is um, that where does this really lead us as we start to do a meditation like this? Well, and here we talk about what yogis realize. So someone like you, think of yourself as a yogi. You're a yogi if you sit down on the meditation cushion and attempt to do these meditations. And where it leads a yogi in meditative equipoise is they come to realize that nothing exists inherently. And this first happens on the path of preparation, which is the second of the five paths that we have in Buddhism, where we can then bring the union of serenity, single pointed concentration, and insight, meaning into the knowledge and awareness through analysis of the object of meditation. We bring them where they arise in a way where we can clearly see emptiness, first inferentially and then directly. And in the process, all appearances become false. But when we hear that, we have to understand that it means that it exists like an illusion. Now we should know through this course what that's code for, what that really means. Doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It means it doesn't exist inherently. That's all we're negating here. So this is very important. So the point I was making earlier, I'm underscoring here. A yogi gets to the point where they can establish both the ultimate truth and the conventional truth without one contradicting the other. So this is important. And then Chandrakirti concludes. Um, Although the car is not established in the seven ways that we talked about earlier, both in terms of ultimate reality and the world, we here input the car in dependence on its parts without analyzing and through everyday convention alone. So he's making the point here that unless we do these meditations, we will we will, if we do the meditations, we'll understand the first three lines of the verse. But if we don't do these meditations, meaning without analysis, what he says in the fourth line is we will conventionally experience these things as having inherent self-existence. So it's something to really, really, get clear on through, in terms of why you would do these meditations. So we have a little bit of time left, and so I'm going to stay a few minutes longer if you guys want to answer any questions you have. But I wanted to take the sevenfold reasoning of Chandrakirti and show you how it applies to Nagarjuna's refutations. We know that Nagarjuna came before Chandrakirti. So Chandrakirti used this sevenfold reasoning that he developed based on Nagarjuna's refutations. And in his, he applies it to the analysis of the Tathagatas, meaning enlightened ones, and ourselves. How does he do this? And in analytically exploring the relationship between our aggregates, we all know what they are, we talked about them earlier, and the self. And this is in order to refute, these are refutations, refute the inherent existence of the self. So here we're just going to read through and then dissect one of them, but we're going to read through three of his, um, they're either 4 or 5 points that are very similar to Chandrakirti's sevenfold reasoning, but distilled into a lesser amount of points. Chandrakirti expanded them in order to really nail down how difficult it is to refute when we're looking at the I, ourself, how to refute inherent self-existence. Remember, I talked about that a few minutes ago. So here in his treatise on the middle way, and I numbered them in the verse, neither one with the aggregates nor different from the aggregates. Sound familiar? The aggregates are not based on him, nor is he based on the aggregates. What is the Tathagatas? He's talking about the Buddha. And in a letter to a friend, it has been said that the body is not the self. The self is not the possessor of the body. The self is not based on the body. The body is not based on a self. Like that, understand that the remaining four aggregates are empty too. The other four aggregates. He's only using the body here. So you could repeat this verse 5 times over, just substituting the other four aggregates. Then in Precious Garland, he says the aggregates are not the self, nor are they based on the self, nor is the self based on the aggregates. But without them, the self cannot exist. The self and aggregates are not mixed like fire and fuel. Therefore, how could the self exist? So here, um, Nagarjuna is presenting very similar argument to sevenfold reasoning. You can see that in all three of these when we talk about, the first two that he presents in each one of these sets of verses. Um, of course, in Precious Garland, he adds a fifth point. Um, but the point being made in all three verses that the person does not exist inherently. It's the same point being made. So we have to realize that um, here that we need to, as we try to look at one of these verses, and we're going to look at Precious Garland. this verse. We have to first start by saying, how would an inherently existent person exist? You always have to start with that. Otherwise, how can you be looking for it in the meditation? So here, the words, we're using some different words. It's inherent self-existing person is self-instituting, exists in its own right without depending on any other factor whatsoever. So we have to keep that in mind. And keeping that in mind, as we analyze how the person exists, we take the five uh, points that, and there's actually 6 points here, but they're the points that are analyzing the 5 points that are made in Chandrakirti's, in Nagarjuna's Precious Garland quote that we just read. So here we start with the aggregates are not the self. So if the aggregates were the person, they would be identical in every way. Sound familiar? Sevenfold reasoning, right? In that case, the words body and self would refer to the same thing. Instead of saying the person is thinking, we could say the leg is thinking. And instead of saying the person is walking, we could say the mental factor of integrity is walking. We may say, I'm sick when the body is sick, and I'm happy when the aggregate of feeling is a happy feeling. But that is because the I is dependent on the aggregates, not because the I is the aggregates. So that's the analysis done in connection with the first point. And then in connection with the second point, the self is not totally separate from the aggregates. If the person and the aggregates were inherently separate, they would be unrelated, and the person would not depend on the aggregates. Sound familiar? Car and its parts? In that case, the body could be in France and the person could be in India. When the body aged, we couldn't say, I'm getting old. And when the mind is sleepy, the person could be wide awake. In short, the self and the aggregates are related. The collection of the aggregates is the basis of designation of the person. And without the aggregates, a person could not exist. So here, again, just like I did with the sevenfold reasoning applied to a car, I'm only going to go through those first two. The other four, it's very similar arguments to the sevenfold reasoning. So we could see that the same reasoning sets of reasonings can be used. And here, not only does it sound similar to the two that I reasoned and presented related to a car and its parts, but here we're talking about the body, a specific aggregate. We could substitute body and utilize any one of the five. So this is important. This is a very robust way to work on negating the object, working with the object of negation, which is the inherent existence of self. So here, the meditation we would do, and this will be the last thing we cover for tonight. And then I'm going to quickly just do a walk through diamond slivers and dependent arising meditations as other antidotes that we have available to us, but just so you could see what they're composed of and how they're different than the sevenfold reasoning. But I jump ahead. So here in relationship to the points that we just covered, and then there's additional points that I didn't go into detail on, but listed there above. We are focused on how does the I exist when we're going through this analysis. So first, we think if the I existed inherently, would it be a self-enclosed entity, independent of all other factors? And that leads us to say, in that case, its relationship with the aggregates must be such that neither is identically one and the same as the aggregates are completely unrelated to them. There's actually no room for dependent existence in an inherently existing world. I'm going to stop there and let you think about that for a minute. Look around you. We live in a dependently existing world. There's no other kind of world. But we can't come to the conclusion as there is no inherent existing object. We can start to see that there's no room for such a thing in the dependent existing world. And then third, we contemplate the points above, the ones that we walk through, these bullet points. We only went through a couple, but just to give us a taste. And to determine if it's possible for the I to exist inherently. So that's our focus, right? And you reflect on the inconsistencies of saying the aggregates are the self. You reflect why I cannot be totally unrelated to the aggregates. You reflect whether the I possesses the aggregates either in the way you possess a book or in the way that you possess your hand. You see if the aggregates are the base of the self or if the self is the base of all the aggregates. Can the self and the aggregates be mixed like fuel and fire? And once you analyze all those, you get to the point that because the above ways, just like with the sevenfold reasoning, exhaust all possible options for inherent existence, you affirm, you conclude that the I cannot exist inherently. And most important when doing this kind of analysis, when through deep and careful analysis and probing, that's with your focus concentration, you conclude that inherent existence doesn't exist at all. Remember, you're in a meditative state when you're doing this. You let the mind rest in that emptiness of inherent existence. This is where you bring single pointed concentration with the awareness of what arised out of the analytical process. Emptiness of inherent existence is the conclusion. You let your mind rest in that. So, here in your meditation, what that means is the appearance of the I, remember, that's what we're looking at, as inherently existent now disappears, and its emptiness, the complete absence of inherent existence, appears as your meditation object. And that's what they mean when they say without elaboration. So this gives us a taste of how the process works when you're doing this kind of analytical meditation. And I'll end this by uh, reading through a verse that explains this process by Losong Chogyan. When from observing the aggregates, you have a sense of I, this is how we normally feel. And through a reliable cognizer, that's your own ability to cognize things as they happen and function, you ascertain that I not to be truly established as it seems, though it appears so to you, I should say, though, you have undermined the grasping of inherent existence that otherwise you could not. Because normally you're not paying attention to these things. So when you observe the aggregates and think, I am, and a non-affirming negation, the mere negation of a truly established I, is the apprehended object. You apprehend that non-affirming negation of the cognition of selflessness without losing the force of that awareness. Don't lose the force of that awareness, that aha moment. Maintain with intense clarity and free of mental laxity and restlessness. You destroy the grasping. You destroy the grasping of the objective existence of I. You don't destroy the I, the grasping of it. Remember, that's the object of negation that Nagarjuna told us about at the top of this session. So, when you have observed the aggregates and experience I don't exist and are skilled in sustaining a perception of the view, sustaining that perception, it counters the sense of a fixated concrete I, that inherent existent I. And you can evict grasping an I. But those who have accomplished this are as rare as a star in the daytime. So, when the observed object, so here, before I go to that conclusion, what is that last line is interesting. Everything else that comes before that is sort of breaking down for you how you go about doing these meditations and then how you carry that force forward with clarity. And and then it eventually ends up evicting grasping. At the end, it says, but this is rare. And it says it's rare not to be kind of to be a downer, but rather to have you be clear-eyed that doing these kind of meditations are challenging because it's not the way we normally look at things. And that when we do them, we have to do them with force and we have to sustain them. We have to sustain and we have to do them with force. That means it's a lot of work. And it's rare when somebody is able to do that. So it's a challenge. It doesn't mean that it's rare because hardly anybody could do it. It just means that it's really hard. And we need to conclude that when we get through the goal of these kinds of meditations is when the observed object in this kind of analysis leads us to an awareness, as I talked about before, of the conventional self, the mere I. It's not the object that we do negate, but we're able to then observe when we're looking at the conventional self, we can clearly see the mere I. And that we can clearly see that there's a difference between the self-grasping ignorance of that mere I and what we call the wisdom realizing emptiness, meaning that we have awareness of its true nature. That is just a mere I. It's not inherently self-existing. So it's not that it's not there, nihilism, or that it's inherently there, absolutism. That's the wisdom that we can apply to conventional self. This is where most people fall down. So they have the same observed object, the mere I, but they apprehend it in these opposite ways I just said. So this is something that I'd like you to leave you with, that at the end of it, when you go through these meditations, both conventional reality and ultimate reality should become very clear to you, and they should create some of those results that I talked about at the top of the class tonight. So I'll leave it there and see if anybody has any questions or comments they'd like to. Oh, wait, I did say that I was going to just walk through quickly. The diamond slivers. I'm not going to walk through them. This will be saved as a PDF and I'll give it to Gloria so she could post it at on the calendar listing of the event because it's too much to go through. So, and we're at 8:30 almost. So I'll just say that the diamond slivers are also known as the Vajra slivers. And they're specifically designed to pierce through the illusion of inherently existing permanent phenomena. So it's very much focused on that. And then it's made up of four arguments, just like the sevenfold reasoning has seven, and then versions of that came before the sevenfold reasoning that Nagarjuna presented, sometimes 4 points, sometimes five. Here, the diamond slivers has 4 points. Does the entity arise from itself? Does it arise from something other than itself? Does it arise from both? Does it arise from neither, meaning causelessly? So we won't go into it beyond that, but here you could see that this is a different way to tackle looking at um, that idea of an independent, permanent, inherently self-existing self. And then dependent arising, it's a meditation practice that focuses on understanding um, all phenomena, both mental and physical, and how all sentient beings and objects of engagement are interconnected and arise based on causes and conditions. There's no other way they can arise. No other way they can arise. That ipso facto negates inherent existence. If nothing can exist outside of the realm of dependent arising, then it's logical to conclude. So this here, the principles that are independent arising, we often use the 12 links of dependent origination. So we got a little taste of that in our talk. And then there's different methods for practicing it. That's what is listed here. So we're at 8:32. I have to stop. So let me ask if anybody has any questions. And I'm sorry that we didn't have more time.
John, there
Uh,
was a question earlier in the chat.
oh, I didn't see that. I
Yeah,
apologize. Oh,
and
there.
then thanks for sending me those files. I'll post them.
Yeah,
Okay.
I didn't send them yet. I'll send them
Yeah,
afterwards.
no, but when you do, yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Okay. All right. The question from Linda is, I'm confused about fellow senior students who identified themselves as secular Buddhists. Are these the teachings that they are using to support their perspective? But Mahayamika is not secular philosophy, is it? It's built on Mahayana, Vajrayana practice slash Vajrayana practice, which builds on the experience of bodhicitta, doesn't it? Which is experienced as a visceral devotional experience. But does it need to build on Mahayana, Vajrayana practices, which might be more allied to Hinayana levels of practice? I'm confused. Okay, so there's a lot there, but mm, I can say this much about that question, um, that all Mahayana practice is built, and especially the Mahayamika, is built on the three principal teachings. Um, and and those three principal teachings are all built on a foundation, which are renunciation, bodhicitta, and the wisdom of emptiness. And those are built on having a full-fledged awareness of the true meaning of the Four Noble Truths. So this is something that is interwoven and present in all Mahayana, Sutrayana practices and all Vajrayana practices as well. The, without renunciation, bodhicitta, and wisdom, as we learn them in the Sutrayana path, Vajrayana practice is fruitless. It's all one path. So one is a building a block to the other. Um, then when you talk about, secular Buddhist and Hinayana level practice, that's a lot more to talk about. And probably we don't have time here for that, but I'm happy to talk to you more about it, like through email or, and you have my email because we've communicated before, or we can do a Zoom session, whatever. But I'll say that much. Um, so, uh, yeah, and then there's another point that was made on the chat to me that aren't all Buddhists, like secular. When we speak from the point of view of theism, you could say that because there's not the involvement. Theism has to do with there being a cosmology and a dogmatic, institutionalized system where part of the um, scenario, if you will, is the presence of a creator. So then that isn't overtly present in Buddhist practices. So then from that point of view, one could say that to that comment. Um, okay, so we could leave it there. And if any of you want me to do a session next Tuesday, I'd be happy to. And we would focus on doing a meditative walkthrough of diamond slivers and dependent arising. We would not talk about anything else. An hour and a half would be fine to be able to walk through, giving you a taste of those too. So I'll talk to Gloria, and it doesn't matter. Not all of you need to be there, but if there's at least a handful of you want to come, then we'll do that. Um, I've gotten a few texts just now saying yes, 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 yes. So let's plan on it. I'll communicate with Gloria about that, and we'll put it on the calendar. Because next Tuesday will be the last Tuesday where the winter um, teaching sessions are um, being done on Tuesday nights. And I think, Chappelle, am I correct? The following Tuesday will be going back to the regular class schedule for what normally occurs on Tuesday evenings.
I'm not certain about that, but I think that is the case.
Okay. Yeah, Gloria had to jump, so I can't ask her. But definitely she had already offered me to do next Tuesday. So why don't we plan on it? Whoever can attend, it will be fun. We'll be less like talking about all these concepts, and we'll get a little bit more of a taste of the actual meditations, but also take some time to listen through the material that's been presented. If you want, Chappelle puts the recordings on DNKL's website, and bring some questions. Sometimes it's hard to formulate questions when I'm hitting you with sort of rapid fire, boop, 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 point, 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 point. So please feel free to do that as well. Okay. All right. Somebody's also asking us to record next Tuesday's session. We'll do that. I think we can end it though for tonight, Chappelle. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, John. See you.
Okay, everybody.